مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هذه أفضل الأوقات، هذه أسوأ الأوقات. كلمات تشارلز ديكنز الشهيرة هذه يمكنها أن تصف الأشهر الثلاثة الأخيرة منذ أن تسلم جو بايدن الرئاسة. الأخبار الجيدة هي جيدة جدا. كانت البطالة في نوفمبر منخفضة للغاية، إذا بلغت 4.6% فقط، وتراجعت بعد أن كانت حوالي 7% قبل عام. تم خلق أكثر من 5.6 ملايين وظيفة منذ أن تولى بايدن منصبه، ومنذ عودة أجزاء كبيرة من الاقتصاد إلى قوتها الكاملة بعد أيام ربيع 2020 الرهيبة. وكثير من هؤلاء العمال يكسبون اليوم أكثر بكثير مما كانوا يكسبونه قبل عام. لكن هذا نص القصة فقط. النص الآخر ليس جيدا. في أكتوبر كان التضخم، الزيادة في الأسعار، أعلى مما كان عليه طيلة 30 عاما، حيث ارتفع بشكل أسرع من ارتفاع الأجور. هذا يعني أن العمال قد يكسبون المزيد من الأجر، لكن يمكنهم شراء أشياء أقل بما لديهم من مال. وحتى مع إقرار الكونغرس للبرنامج بنية تغطية دعم، فحكومتنا ما زالت معطلة، حيث بدأت تقترب نهاية مدة اتفاقية قصيرة الأجل لتسديد الدين الوطني. هل الأخبار الجيدة تفوق الأخبار السيئة؟ أم أن الأخبار السيئة هي أهم من الأخبار الجيدة؟ لمناقشة التداعيات السياسية على وضعنا الاقتصادي المتباين، يسرني أن أرحب بمراسلين سياسيين لامعين ديفيد دراكر وإلين غودفري. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today, let's talk about two completely different narratives about our economy, our politics, and our society, and how they are shaping our national discussion. I'm delighted to welcome David Drucker and Elaine Godfrey to go through these with us today. First, let's talk about the good news. David, if you were to look at our national economy today, what's the good news story?
Well, the good news, especially compared to the heart of the coronavirus pandemic over the past couple of years, is that more people are working, fewer people are requesting unemployment insurance, consumer spending is up, economic growth is up, and so many employers are complaining, and this is a great complaint, that they have job openings and there are not enough people to fill them, which suggests that the economy is poised to take off even further in the coming months. Of course, so often people judge the economy, and this will have political ramifications. They judge the economy based on how they feel about it. And right now, Americans are still very unsettled. The Omicron variant of the coronavirus is going to contribute to that. And so when voters and when Americans look at skyrocketing inflation, and it is historically high compared to the last 3 or 4 decades, and they look at some of the supply chain issues in terms of imported goods and getting them into the United States and onto the shelves, they see an economy that still worries them. And so they're not treating the economy necessarily as though it's doing so much better than it was, but the signs are there that it is. It's just a matter of getting people to the point, or them getting themselves to the point where they believe everything is finally on the right track again.
So you're already jumping to the bad news story, but you're right, because they're both narratives are real. And so, Elaine, if you were to look at other issues on our national agenda, let's take COVID for example. Is there a good news story about COVID, even before we get to the bad news of the coming of Omicron?
Sure. I mean, the good news is that a lot of Americans are vaccinated, and there are boosters out now that are available to everyone, almost. I think, and that's the good news. And for a lot of people in a lot of places, including I live here in D.C. Um, uh, they've removed their mask mandates, so life is sort of going back to normal. Now that's the good news. That was sort of our good week before we found out about this Omicron variant, which is definitely going to throw a lot of that up in the air again.
And then when I take a look at other issues on our national agenda, like last year, for example, riots, protests, demonstrations on the issue of race. Today, the issue of race is in the courts far more than on the streets. One has to assume that for most politicians, this counts as good news. David?
Certainly. And although the discussion around race and race relations in America and the extent to which racism is still a part of daily life in America for so many people is still a part of the discussion we're having, what we are seeing in most cities and communities across the country is a reduction in the riots and the civil unrest that roiled our cities during the pandemic after the murder of George Floyd. And I think that the verdict in the Ahmaud Arbery case down in Georgia has to help cool tensions in that regard, because it shows that some of this is being taken seriously and not just treated as it was for so many decades. By the same token, what we are experiencing in many American communities still is crime that is higher than it was before the pandemic and before the murder of George Floyd. People are concerned about how much policing they have, whether or not it's effective. There's still a major debate going on in terms of whether or not the police and law enforcement are getting the resources they need. And so again, it's good news, bad news. It's saying it's reason for hope and reason for anxiety when you look at both sides of the story here.
And Elaine, how is this sort of translating into politics? Just let's take a look at the issues of race, justice, police reform. Is there the same energy on this issue as there was a year ago? How is this beginning to translate into politics?
So I think that's an interesting question. Is there the same energy as there was a year ago? I guess I would say no. I mean, Congress is very tied up right now on several different things. Politicians are talking about other things. I mean, there's still this conversation of defund the police, police reform, all of that. But it is definitely not in the foreground in the same way, at least based on my reporting. And I think that doesn't mean it's less important. Certainly, I think the recent case, the Kyle Rittenhouse case in Wisconsin, I think that's a great example too of if that case had come about last year. Obviously, it wouldn't have, because it was the circumstances of that case were sort of brought on by all the unrest from last year. But if it had happened last year, I think that the reaction would have been very different. I think that people's reaction was not as reaction to his acquittal was not as aggressive this time as it perhaps could have been in a different climate last year. And I think I agree with David that the Arbery result was also sort of an answer to racial justice questions in this country too. And I think that it sort of shows maybe it's a little bit calmer now. The energy there is less energy behind it.
Interesting. And there's another sort of big issue, and many big issues, but here's another one that I guess if you're on Team Biden, you have to heave a sort of sigh of relief. Just reading the newspaper, Afghanistan seems to be in the rearview mirror right now. After a pretty horrible late summer, early autumn, Elaine, you don't really hear too much discussion of this anymore.
You don't. But I will say, I feel like that was the beginning of Biden's low ratings, right? Like that's where we saw sort of that was the tipping point. At least, what I noticed was after Afghanistan, it sort of all went downhill from there, because his approval is in the low 40s now, which is incredibly low. It's hard for a president to come back from that. But yeah, I mean, we're not hearing about it anymore, and we're not really even talking about the refugee resettlement in this country, which is ongoing right now, and around the world. And I think that's, I guess, good news for Biden. He could use sort of any of the good news that he could get, but I think it's in the rearview mirror mostly because there are a lot of other worse things facing the administration right now.
And David, do you see this as an issue that will sort of hound Joe Biden the way Benghazi sort of hounded Barack Obama, or is it fading?
I don't think it's fading at all, but I think there are deeper issues here that Afghanistan represents. I've talked to Republican pollsters about this for months. Some Republican strategists will tell me that the real problem for Joe Biden began when the coronavirus refused to fade away. The Delta variant surged in the spring, summer, and early fall. And so much of the aura around Joe Biden's election was that finally we were going to have a president that would deal with the virus and shut it down, and it would no longer be a problem and we would get back to normal. Now, the fact that that didn't happen is not Joe Biden's fault, but when you're a president, you get blamed more than you should. You get a lot more credit than you deserve. What the Afghanistan debacle, though, did is puncture the other key component of why voters, particularly swing voters and soft Republicans in the United States, people that vote for Democrats and Republicans, depending on the election, and are not strong partisans, why they elected him. They elected him because they thought that they were exhausted by Trump, Donald Trump, and all of his antics. And Joe Biden, I might not always agree with him, but he will be competent and everything will calm down and be normal. And what the Afghanistan pullout represented to this key group of voters was that Joe Biden lacked the confidence in their eyes that they hoped he would have. And whenever you have a politician, Democrat or Republican, and you remove the number one and number two reasons why voters really supported them, it really takes the political wind out of their sails, and it leaves them right where Joe Biden is today, which, as Elaine mentioned, an approval rating in the low 40s. And it's very hard to govern and lead from that position, as we saw with former President Donald Trump over his 4 years. He quickly ended up in the low 40s, never was able to dig his way out of it, and it hampered his ability to lead on a lot of these big issues.
So when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at exactly why President Biden is in the low 40s and how this is likely to affect his leadership going forward, congressional debates over key pieces of legislation, and as we begin 2022, as we start another election year, and what this all means for the Democrats and the Republicans. When we come back after the break in just a moment. I love musical theater. When I was 8 years old, I saw Man of La Mancha, starring the great Richard Kiley, who performed the role of Don Quixote more than 2,000 times, and I was hooked. If you love musical theater, then you have to mourn the passing at the age of 92 of Stephen Sondheim, an American original who totally transformed musical theater from a simple, often formulaic form of entertainment into a complex operatic experience in which the full range of human emotion, human frailty, and human contradiction was on display. Go online and see, hear, and experience this for yourself. From his first great masterpiece, West Side Story, the retelling of Romeo and Juliet in a New York barrio, to one of the most hilarious shows ever produced, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, to one of the darkest, most macabre, Sweeney Todd. I promise, something in Sondheim's remarkable repertoire will light a fire in you impossible to extinguish. Again, my guests today include David M. Drucker. David is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Previously, he served as senior editor of CQ Roll Call an insider newspaper covering Capitol Hill, and as a political reporter for the Los Angeles Daily News, covering politics in his home state of California. Also joining us is Elaine Godfrey. Elaine is a politics reporter at The Atlantic, one of America's leading magazines of news and ideas. A native of Iowa, she has also written for Real Clear Politics and New York Magazine. All right, so Elaine, let's begin this session taking a look at Joe Biden's low approval ratings. When we look at this historically, this is so unusual, especially for someone who doesn't have, a great personal crisis, a national calamity, a personal scandal that drags you down by 10, 15 points. Why is it so low for Joe Biden?
So I would say that Biden is an example or a lesson in why doing popular things, or at least attempting to do some popular things, doesn't mean people will like you, doesn't mean you'll be popular. I mean, he passed, he and the Democrats passed a stimulus this year that was popular, bipartisan infrastructure reform that was broadly popular. They've pushed a $2 trillion spending package that contains a lot of, broadly popular proposals through the House. Still has to go through the Senate, so we'll see what happens there. But I mean, he's done a lot of these popular things. Ostensibly, he should be a popular guy. COVID's not his fault, right? but people vote and perceive of the situation in America based on, are things feeling good? Is the climate of the country good? COVID hasn't gone away. In fact, we have a new strain, right, that we're figuring out how to deal with. We have inflation, the highest prices people are paying in years for gas, for groceries. People feel that. It's very personal to people. Build Back Better, his $2 trillion spending, supposed to be a good thing, right, for Democrats, supposed to be their win. And it hasn't gone great for them. They've trimmed it down a lot. Now it's going to struggle to pass the Senate. We'll see if that happens before Christmas, which is their goal. This is all bad news for Biden, and a lot of it is not necessarily his fault. I think it's just a lesson. It just goes to show voters vote on the climate. They vote on the political climate and the economic climate more than on, is this president pursuing things that I like.
And David, how does being in the 40s, the low 40s, how does this affect a president's ability to govern? What does he need to do? Does he look at the numbers every day, and how does it affect his decisions?
Well, look, when members of your own party, never mind the opposing party, don't believe that you have the full support or a healthy support of Americans behind you, you feel less inclined to follow their lead. In fact, you worry that if you follow their lead, you're going to end up right back where they are. And part of the job of being a chief executive in a political sense is being able to coalesce the parties, coalesce lawmakers, be able to put your hand on the scale of intra-party disagreements, put pressure on the opposing party to come along and at least join you for some of these things. When your numbers are weak, not only do people feel, no fear or disinclined to listen to you because the perception is, well, voters aren't with you, so why should I be? You're also afraid that if I associate with you too much, I'll end up where you are. I think the big problem for Joe Biden is that even though he is tackling a number of issues that in theory many Americans may appreciate, and I think this Build Back Better $2 trillion package is a good example where they have things like taxpayer funded childcare, taxpayer funded pre-K school for children. Voters don't give you points for doing things you like. They give you points for doing things that are most important to you at any given time. And, in your own party, when they see that you're a winner, they're also not going to want to give you too much trouble. I think this is a lot about not just the dysfunction in American politics at the current time, the tribal nature of American politics, but the choices policymakers are making that is leading them down this path.
And Elaine, do you agree that there is a governing strategy for a majority in America today?
I think there is. I think COVID makes it hard because, like I said, COVID is, people are feeling it. It is perhaps the thing people are feeling the most in this country, that and the economy. And I think that under different pandemic circumstances, maybe a president could do a lot better than Biden, than Donald Trump, as far as being broadly popular. I agree with David there, that's the case. Yeah.
All right, fascinating. Well, thank you both very much for helping to explain this gray, neither black nor white universe in which American politics is operating today. And thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. In the beginning, there was a virus. We called it COVID-19. It changed everything. And then, as millions were dying around the world, we witnessed one of the great scientific miracles of our time, as immunologists developed vaccines to protect us against this invisible killer. Everyone who could rushed to take advantage of this miracle. Well, most of us, but not all. I have little sympathy and less understanding for anti-vaxxers who purposefully and consciously put themselves, their loved ones, and everyone around them at risk for the sake of their vanity. I fully support the idea that everyone has a right to be an idiot, but, like to paraphrase the definition of free speech, one's idiocy ends when it threatens my life. Well, back to the story. By early summer, we were turning the corner on COVID-19, and the world began to open up. Then came Delta, a variant that once again turned the world upside down. The vast majority of those killed by the new variant were the unvaccinated, but even those of us who were vaccinated were eager for whatever additional protection science could provide, and the rush for boosters soon followed. Thanks to boosters, infection rates lowered even more. Again, we were turning a corner. But life in the COVID era, it seems, is a maze with many corners. After COVID and after Delta comes Omicron, so named by skipping over the Greek letter Xi, which apparently would have proven embarrassing to the Chinese leader, whose name is spelled the same, though not pronounced that way. In just the first few hours since Omicron was identified by diligent researchers in South Africa, the world has once again begun to shut down, with countries as varied as Morocco and Israel closing their airspace to civilian travelers, threatening my planned family vacation in Marrakesh. Will Omicron prove to be as deadly as some fear? Or, as we say in America, a flash in the pan? Obviously, I hope for the latter. Well, what do we know? At least three things. First, we will have to live with the threat of variants. It is part of the life of a virus, which means it is part of our life. Second, fast is really fast. I remember when the first articles about COVID were in the newspaper in February 2020, and there was an orderly shutdown of schools and businesses in mid-March. Now, change happens in a matter of hours. It is dizzying. Third, and most importantly, as corny and hackneyed as it sounds, we really are in this together, all around the world. If a variant discovered in the southern tip of Africa can affect my life in Washington in the blink of an eye, it underscores the idea that I have an interest in spreading access to vaccines as far and wide as possible, as quickly as possible. I realized I reached that conclusion based on self-interest, not on magnanimity, but nothing motivates like self-interest. So let's vaccinate the world. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول السياسة الاقتصادية لإدارة بايدن، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.